Captain Shadrach Inman sat on horseback near the Enoree River with barely 24 men behind him. Across the water waited a British-led force more than twice the size of the entire American column. Inman's orders sounded almost suicidal. Ride forward, show yourself, start a fight, then run. Not withdraw in good order. Run hard enough to convince the men chasing him that the Americans had panicked. Because half a mile away, hidden behind a wooded ridge, nearly 200 militiamen were waiting behind a rough line of logs and brush. They did not need to defeat 500 men in open ground. They needed the enemy to leave a stronger position, cross a river, climb toward them, and enter a killing zone without realizing the ground had been chosen for them. If Inman failed, the trap failed. If he succeeded too well, he might never make it back. 3 months earlier, the British campaign in the South looked unstoppable. Charleston had fallen in May, taking thousands of American troops with it. British commanders were extending control inland through forts, Loyalist militia, roads, river crossings, and small garrisons across the Carolina backcountry. Musgrove Mill fit that system perfectly. The mill sat near an Enoree River crossing and processed grain from the surrounding countryside. Whoever held it controlled food and movement through the interior. It was not a great fortress. It did not need to be. In a war fought across thin roads and scattered farms, a working mill beside a river crossing mattered. That was why the Americans came. Their force was a collection of frontier militia under Isaac Shelby, Elijah Clark, and James Williams. Shelby brought men from the western settlements. Clark led hardened Georgia fighters. Williams brought South Carolina militia operating in territory the British believed they were bringing under control. Together, they had about 200 men. They were mobile, knew the backcountry, and could strike isolated posts before a larger force closed on them. What they could not do was fight twice their number in open ground. Their original plan at Musgrove depended on surprise. Intelligence suggested the post was held by a relatively small Loyalist force. The Americans could hit it quickly, overwhelm it, then move before British reinforcements arrived. That plan began to collapse before the main battle even started. American scouts encountered a Loyalist patrol. Shots were exchanged, men were wounded. The defenders now knew they were there. Then came the worst news. Musgrove Mill had been reinforced. The force around the crossing was not the small detachment the Americans expected. It had grown to roughly 500 men, including provincial troops and Loyalist militia. Some were disciplined enough to fight in formation, some carried bayonets, and now they had warning. Shelby, Clark, and Williams faced 3 bad choices: attack the post and risk being swallowed by superior numbers. Wait, and give nearby British forces time to move against them. Retreat and abandon the raid without accomplishing anything. But the commanders noticed one thing that changed the problem completely. They did not have to attack Musgrove Mill. They only had to make the men at Musgrove Mill attack them. A wooded ridge stood back from the river. The ground rose away from the crossing and offered cover, concealment, and a place to build a temporary defensive line. If the British-led force stayed near the mill, its numbers were dangerous. If those men could be pulled away from the crossing, pushed along a predictable approach, and brought uphill toward hidden rifles, the same numbers would become harder to use. So the Americans stopped thinking like raiders. They began building a battlefield. And inside that plan was a job for barely 24 horsemen: convince a stronger enemy that the Americans were already running. The new information changed everything. The Americans had expected a vulnerable post. Instead, they had walked toward a force large enough to crush them if the fight developed on British terms. Roughly 500 men were gathered around Musgrove Mill and the Enoree crossing. They were not all regular British infantry, but that did not make them harmless. Loyalist militia knew the same roads and forests the Americans knew. Provincial troops had more formal training, better discipline, and critically, bayonets. That last detail mattered. Many of Shelby's frontiersmen carried rifles. In the woods, those weapons were deadly. They could hit individual targets at ranges where a smoothbore musket became unreliable. But rifles took longer to reload, and most could not mount a bayonet. At distance, the Americans had an advantage. At 10 feet, they had a problem. So an open fight near the mill was exactly what they needed to avoid. The commanders began studying the ground behind them. About half a mile from the Enoree stood a wooded ridge. high enough to dominate the approach from the river, but covered heavily enough to conceal men from anyone coming up the road. The slope itself was not dramatic. That was useful. Nothing about it screamed fortress. Nothing warned an approaching column that the landscape ahead had already been turned into a weapon. Shelby, Clark, and Williams decided to make their stand there. The decision was risky for one simple reason. They were choosing to remain close to a stronger enemy after surprise had already been lost. Every minute mattered now. Men dragged fallen logs into position. Branches were cut and piled together. Brush was packed into gaps. There was no time for trenches, walls, or proper earthworks. They were not building a fort. They were creating just enough protection to break the force of an advancing line and just enough concealment to hide exactly how many Americans were waiting. The breastwork curved across the ridge in a rough semicircle. Shelby's men took the right. Williams held the center. Clark covered the left. Around 40 men were held back as a reserve. That may have looked wasteful. With only about 200 fighters available, every musket behind the main line seemed necessary. But the commanders understood something that would matter later. A trap does not end when the enemy enters it. If the first volley failed to stop the attack, someone would have to close the gaps. The terrain solved only half the problem. The British-led force still had to come to them. From the mill, there was no reason to do that. The defenders held the river crossing, had superior numbers, and knew the Americans were nearby. They could simply remain in place and force Shelby's men either to attack or withdraw. So the Americans needed to change what the enemy believed was happening. They needed Musgrove's defenders to stop thinking defensively. They needed them angry, confident, certain that the Americans were weaker than they really were. And most importantly, they needed them moving. This was where the plan became more dangerous than a normal ambush. A hidden line in the woods is only useful if the enemy approaches it from the right direction. If the British sent scouts ahead, the breastwork might be discovered. If they advanced slowly, they could stop outside effective range. If they deployed too early, their numbers could stretch around both American flanks. The Americans could not simply wait and hope. They had to control the enemy's decision. Captain Shadrach Inman was chosen to do it. He was given a small mounted detachment, roughly 20 to 25 men, a force tiny enough to look vulnerable, but large enough to make contact and survive long enough to be noticed. Their mission was built around deception: cross the enemy, approach the British position. Fire. Make the defenders believe they had caught part of the American force exposed. Then fall back. But even a fake retreat could become real very quickly. The men at Musgrove had horses of their own. They had troops capable of moving aggressively. And once Inman crossed the river, there would be no breastwork in front of him, no reserve immediately behind him, and no guarantee that the enemy would react exactly as planned. If they refused to chase, the entire scheme died. If they chased too fast, Inman's men could be cut down before reaching the ridge. If they recognized the deception, they could advance cautiously and turn the trap against the Americans. Shelby was asking a handful of riders to do something much harder than simply attack. They had to lose convincingly without actually losing control. And on the other side of the river, a British officer was about to make the decision the Americans had been waiting for. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Innes had every reason to believe the Americans were the ones in trouble. The men around Musgrove Mill outnumbered the raiders by more than 2 to 1. The river crossing remained in Loyalist hands. The American scouts had already exposed themselves. And somewhere beyond the enemy, a militia force that had come expecting an easy strike was now sitting in silence. From Innes's side of the river, that silence could look like hesitation. That was exactly what the Americans needed. The force included Loyalist militia and provincial troops, capable of holding formation and pressing an attack with bayonets once the distance closed. So Shelby's plan could not depend on the enemy behaving foolishly. It depended on giving a competent officer incomplete information. Innes knew the Americans were nearby. He knew they were outnumbered. What he did not know was that the ridge beyond the river had been prepared for him. Captain Shadrach Inman and his small mounted party moved toward the ford. Any force leaving Musgrove to pursue them would have to cross there, compressing its movement through a known route. From the ford, the road carried the pursuers away from the safety of the mill and toward rising wooded ground where the American line could remain hidden. Inman crossed. Then he pushed close enough to force contact. Shots broke the morning quiet. The small American detachment exchanged fire with the Loyalists, making itself impossible to ignore. To the men watching from the British side, this did not look like the opening move of a carefully designed battle. It looked like an exposed enemy patrol that had wandered too close. Then Inman turned away. His riders began falling back toward the ford. This was the most delicate moment of the operation. A retreat has its own momentum. Horses bunch together. Men lose sight of one another in timber. One mistake can turn a controlled withdrawal into real confusion, and Inman could not simply sprint for safety. He needed the enemy close enough to believe the chase was working. Behind him, the Loyalists reacted. Innes chose aggression. Roughly 300 men began moving after the Americans, leaving the stronger position around the mill and crossing the Ennery in pursuit. That decision was not irrational. From Innes's perspective, he had a chance to hit a smaller force before it escaped. The Americans had already lost surprise. Their mounted detachment appeared to be retreating. Allowing them to vanish into the backcountry meant giving mobile militia exactly what they wanted: distance, woods, and another chance to strike elsewhere. The logical response was to press them, and that was the hidden strength of the American plan. The trap did not require Innes to make a stupid decision. It gave him a reasonable decision at the wrong time. Inman kept falling back. Across the ford came more men. The pursuit moved away from Musgrove Mill, away from the position that had made 500 defenders dangerous, and onto ground selected by the men they believed they were chasing. Ahead, the wooded ridge still looked empty. Behind the breastwork, Shelby, Williams, and Clark had one final problem. Their rifles could reach the approaching column long before the column reached them. But firing first was not the same as firing effectively. A volley at long range might warn the attackers, slow them down, and give Innes time to deploy his superior numbers. The entire purpose of the pursuit was to deny him that time, so the Americans waited. Inman's riders came closer. The men behind the logs could hear the pursuit behind them now. The bait had worked, but the real trap would depend on something harder than deception. 200 militia would have to watch hundreds of armed men approach and resist the instinct to fire until the distance was almost uncomfortably short. The first men to reach the ridge were Inman's riders. They came back through the trees with the pursuing column close behind them, then disappeared around the American position exactly as planned. For the men waiting behind the breastwork, that was the signal that the deception had worked. Now they had to do nothing. That was harder. Militia warfare usually rewarded speed. See the enemy first, fire first, move before the other side can answer. But Shelby's position had been built around the opposite idea. He wanted the attackers close. Very close. The wooded ridge helped. From below, the line of logs and brush did not look like a formal fortification. Men could kneel behind it without exposing much more than a head or rifle barrel. Trees broke up the shape of the position. The road and slope narrowed what the approaching force could see. But concealment only lasted as long as nobody fired. A single nervous rifleman could ruin the entire design. Behind the logs were men who had spent years hunting in the Carolina and Appalachian backcountry. Many were excellent shots. They were accustomed to choosing individual targets at distance. Now they were being asked to watch hundreds of armed men approach and deliberately ignore shots they knew they could make. The enemy kept coming. Innes did not simply throw his men forward in a mob. Once the pursuit reached the higher ground, the British-led force began organizing for an attack. That mattered. The Americans had succeeded in pulling part of the Musgrove force away from the mill, but they had not somehow erased its discipline. Provincial soldiers could still deploy, dress their line, and advance under officers who understood how to turn a pursuit into a proper assault. The numerical advantage was still real. The danger was still real. And the Americans had one major weakness waiting behind the breastwork with them. Most of their rifles had no bayonets. A rifle could be deadly across open ground. But once an enemy line reached the logs, a rifleman who had just fired might have no time to reload before a steel bayonet was over the barrier. This meant the Americans did not merely need a good first volley. They needed a damaging one. The closer the attackers came, the more destructive that volley would become. But every yard also shortened the time available afterward. That was the calculation. Fire at 150 yards and the enemy might absorb the shots, identify the position, and reorganize. Fire at 100 yards, and the Americans might inflict more casualties, but still leave enough space for officers to restore order. Let the line come closer, and the smoothbore muskets and rifles behind the breastwork could tear into a dense formation before it had time to react. But let them come too close, and the defenders risked being hit by a bayonet charge before they could reload. There was no exact safe distance. Shelby had to judge it while the enemy was moving. The Americans stayed down. Through gaps in the brush, men could now see uniforms. Then equipment. Then faces. There is a later tradition connected to the battle that captures the kind of fire discipline Shelby wanted: hold until the men were close enough to distinguish the buttons on their clothing. Whether every man heard those exact words mattered less than the principle behind them. Do not waste the first shot. Make the enemy pay for every yard he has been allowed to take. The attackers continued up the slope. They had already crossed the river. They had already left the protection of the mill. They had already followed Inman onto ground selected by Shelby. But from their perspective, none of those decisions yet looked disastrous. The Americans had been retreating. The ridge appeared quiet. The men ahead were militia. And British-trained troops had broken militia before. That confidence was not fantasy. Earlier in the war, American militia had often failed under pressure from disciplined troops advancing with bayonets. Only 3 days earlier, at Camden, militia on the American left had collapsed under a British charge, helping turn the battle into a catastrophe. The men at Musgrove did not yet know the full scale of that defeat. But they knew what a bayonet line could do. That knowledge made the silence behind the breastwork more impressive. Nobody needed to imagine what would happen if the first volley failed. They could see the steel coming uphill. 70 yards. Close enough now that the approaching formation filled the spaces between the trees. Close enough that individual targets were no longer difficult to find. Close enough that the Americans were reaching the point from which there would be no second chance to set the trap. The men raised their weapons. After all the scouting, the wrong intelligence, the hurried fortification, the river crossing, and Inman's staged retreat, the entire battle had been compressed into one decision: when to fire. The order finally came. Fire. The ridge erupted, rifles and muskets discharged almost together from behind the logs, and at 70 yards, there was nowhere for the advancing line to hide. Men dropped. Officers shouted. Smoke rolled across the breastwork and hung between the trees. For the Americans, this was the moment the entire plan had been built to create. The enemy had crossed the river. They had climbed away from the mill. They had followed Inman onto the ground Shelby wanted. And now, the first volley had struck them at a distance where every shot mattered. But the line did not collapse. That was the surprise. The men under Alexander Innes had taken a brutal blow, yet enough of them remained organized to keep moving. Instead of recoiling toward the river, they pressed forward. Then came the bayonets. Steel appeared through the powder smoke as provincial troops drove toward the American right, where Shelby's frontiersmen were positioned. This was the answer to the rifles. A frontier rifle could reach farther than a smoothbore musket, and, in experienced hands, could pick out a man at distance. But it was slower to reload, and most of Shelby's men had no bayonet socket on their weapons. Once the British-trained troops closed the final yards, marksmanship stopped being the most important advantage on the field. A man with an unloaded rifle and no bayonet was suddenly holding a long wooden club against a soldier carrying a steel blade. The distance disappeared fast. Shelby's men fired again where they could, but the attackers kept coming. The American right began to give ground. This was the point where a cleaner version of the story would end the battle too early. 20 men had lured the enemy forward. The hidden line had waited. The first volley had landed exactly as intended. The trap had worked, and the Americans were still in danger of losing. Innes's response exposed the weakness inside Shelby's design. An ambush could disrupt a stronger force, but it could not guarantee that force would break. If disciplined troops survived the opening shock and kept advancing, the defenders still had to stop them. Now, the breastwork that had concealed the Americans was becoming a line they might be forced to abandon. For Innes, this was the opening. If his troops broke Shelby's flank, the entire position could unravel. Men in the center would have to choose between facing forward and protecting an exposed side. That was why the Americans had kept roughly 40 men out of the opening fight. The reserve existed for this moment. Fresh men moved toward the threatened section, while Elijah Clark, holding the American left, made a different decision. Instead of only feeding more men into Shelby's side, Clark attacked the enemy's right. Now, Innes had two problems. His men were trying to finish the breakthrough against Shelby while taking new pressure on the opposite flank. The battle was no longer a simple advance against militia behind logs. It had become a contest over which side could reorganize faster after the ambush. Then, in the middle of that confusion, one shot changed the command structure of the attacking force. Alexander Innes was hit. The officer who had chosen to pursue the Americans led the movement across the river and kept his men advancing after the first volley was wounded and fell from his horse. The timing was disastrous. His men were already under heavy fire. Their formation had been disrupted. Clark was pressing one side. Shelby's frontiersmen, who had been falling back, now had a chance to rally. The Americans did not need the entire enemy force to panic. They only needed its forward momentum to stop. For the first time since crossing the Ennery, it did. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but in a fight this compressed, seconds were enough. With Innes wounded and the advance losing coordination, Shelby's men stopped giving ground. The reserve pushed into the threatened section. Clark's pressure on the opposite flank increased. Men who had been backing away from the bayonets turned, found cover again, and began firing into an enemy that was no longer moving forward with the same confidence. The balance of the battle changed almost instantly. A moment earlier, the British-led force had been close to breaking through the American right. Now it was standing exposed on ground it had never intended to defend. That was the hidden danger of the entire pursuit. Innes's men had crossed the Ennery expecting to chase a retreating enemy. They had not brought the battlefield with them. The Americans had. The ridge protected the Patriot line. The woods disrupted visibility. The breastwork gave riflemen cover while they reloaded. And the attackers, once their forward momentum stopped, had very few good choices. Stay where they were and absorb more fire. Try another coordinated charge without their commanding officer fully in control. Or retreat downhill toward the same river, crossing through which they had entered the fight. The Americans kept shooting. Now the long rifles became dangerous again. At bayonet distance, they had been a liability. At 50, 70, 100 yards, they returned to being exactly what the frontiersmen wanted: accurate weapons firing from concealment at men trying to reorganize in the open. The British-led line began to bend backward. At first, the withdrawal appears to have been controlled. Then, pressure from the American flanks increased. Shelby's men came forward. Clark's men kept pushing from the other side. The defensive semicircle was no longer simply holding the ridge. It was squeezing the force in front of it. And this is where the battle's mechanism became complete. The 20 or so riders had created the pursuit. The pursuit had forced the enemy across the river. The terrain had narrowed their approach. Fire discipline had allowed the Americans to strike at close range. The reserve had prevented the bayonet attack from turning one broken flank into a collapse. And when Innes fell, the attacking force lost cohesion at the exact moment the Americans recovered theirs. None of those elements alone would have guaranteed victory. Together, they turned a numerical disadvantage into a sequence of local advantages. The retreat accelerated. Men who had advanced uphill in formation now began moving back toward the Ennery. Once enough soldiers turned away from the fight, officers could no longer easily restore the line. The Americans left the breastwork and pursued. What had begun as a British chase now reversed direction. The hunters were running toward the river. The men they had believed were fleeing were behind them. The fighting lasted roughly an hour, but the final collapse came far faster than the buildup that created it. By the end, the British and Loyalist force had suffered well over 100 casualties by modern estimates, including killed, wounded, and captured. American losses were dramatically lower. For a militia force of roughly 200 men, the result was extraordinary. But the numbers alone miss what made Musgrove Mill important. The Americans had not won because every rifleman was a better fighter than every Loyalist or provincial soldier. They had won because they controlled the sequence. They decided where the enemy would move. They decided when the first major volley would be fired. They preserved men for the moment the original plan almost failed. And most importantly, they understood that a stronger army is only stronger if it can use its strength. Near the mill, 500 men were a serious threat. On a narrow approach toward a hidden ridge, with only part of that force committed and its commander suddenly wounded, that advantage became much harder to exploit. The Americans had solved the problem. Now they intended to use the victory. The road to 96, one of the most important British positions in the South Carolina interior, seemed suddenly vulnerable. After Musgrove Mill, the idea of pressing deeper into British-held territory no longer looked reckless. Then a rider arrived with news from the east. The message was 3 days old, and it changed the meaning of the entire victory. The message came from the east. Camden was gone. 3 days earlier, on August 16th, Horatio Gates had led the main American army in the South against Lord Cornwallis. The result was a disaster. Militia broke under the British attack. Continental troops were left exposed. Hundreds were killed, wounded, or captured, and the army that was supposed to support resistance across the Carolinas had collapsed. The men at Musgrove Mill had just won a battle without knowing that the larger campaign around them had fallen apart. That changed everything. Only minutes earlier, Shelby, Clark, and Williams had been looking toward 96, one of the most important British positions in the backcountry. After Musgrove, pressing deeper suddenly seemed possible. Now it looked suicidal. The Americans had prisoners, wounded men, tired horses, and no large continental force nearby. There was no time to celebrate. The column turned northwest. Instead of riding toward 96, the Americans disappeared into the woods and began a forced retreat toward the mountains of North Carolina. They kept moving through the night. By the time they reached relative safety, they had covered roughly 60 miles. Behind them, the surviving Loyalists also abandoned Musgrove Mill and withdrew toward 96. The Americans had not destroyed British power in the South. They had proved something narrower. British control of the backcountry depended on forts, crossings, roads, food supplies, and Loyalist posts supporting one another. A small mobile force that refused to fight those positions on British terms could make that network vulnerable. At Musgrove Mill, the stronger side possessed the larger force. The weaker side controlled the decision. Shelby and the other commanders identified the one thing their enemy was willing to give them: pursuit. Then they built everything around it. A wooded ridge concealed the line. A rough breastwork reduced the Americans' exposure. A small mounted party looked weak enough to chase. Inman's retreat pulled hundreds of men across the Enoree and away from the position that made their numerical advantage most dangerous. Then the Americans waited until the range had collapsed to roughly 70 yards before firing. The trap did not work because the British-led force was incompetent. Innes made a decision that made sense with the information he had. He saw a smaller enemy, apparently withdrawing. Pursuit offered a chance to destroy that force before it escaped. The Americans won because they controlled what that decision would lead to. Cross the river. Leave the mill. Climb toward the ridge. Close the distance. By the time the hidden position became clear, the pursuit had already delivered the attackers onto ground selected by the defenders. Even then, the outcome was not guaranteed. Innes's men absorbed the opening volley and launched a bayonet attack strong enough to push part of the American line backward. For several minutes, the ambush was close to becoming an American defeat. That is why the reserve mattered. That is why Clark's pressure on the flank mattered, and that is why Innes being wounded at the critical moment mattered. 20 horsemen could create the opportunity. They could not win the battle by themselves. Musgrove Mill did not end the Southern campaign. 6 weeks later, Kings Mountain would strike British plans in the backcountry even harder. But Musgrove had already exposed the weakness. A stronger force is only stronger while it can use its strength. On August 19, 1780, roughly 200 Americans could not overpower 500 opponents directly. So they made the enemy come to them. If you enjoy military history explained through the decisions and tactics that changed the fight, subscribe. Then tell us in the comments, what mattered most at Musgrove Mill? Inman's deception, the decision to hold fire, or the reserve that saved the line? And where are you watching from?